fantastic opportunity to listen to a remarkable story. Before we let our speaker begin, I wanted to just briefly introduce him. His name is Mr. Steen Metz. He was born in Denmark in the 1930s, by my math, probably around 1935. Is that correct, Steen?
That is a long time ago.
And he lived through the Nazi occupation of his country, Denmark. Behind me is the Danish flag. I was talking to Mr. Metz before this about my own Danish heritage, so it's just kind of nice to talk with someone from Denmark, because I don't get an opportunity to do that very often. But aside from living through the Nazi occupation of Denmark, also living through very difficult months in a labor camp, in which he's going to explain both the occupation and his time in Theresienstadt concentration camp. So we're grateful that he's able to return to Palatine High School. He spoke with us a couple of years ago, and we tried to get him back last year, but obviously the pandemic had different ideas for everybody. So we are grateful that we're going to learn about his experiences today and have the opportunity to learn about his firsthand accounts. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. If you all see in your on your screen, there is a Q&A opportunity. So if you do have a question throughout the presentation, feel free to put that question into there, and I'll be able to relay those questions to Mr. Metz as he will permit time for answering questions as well. So please feel free to answer any questions you may have. And at the end of his story, we'll give you the opportunity to do that. All right, so Mr. Metz, please take it away.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate being invited back. I love to see the Danish flag in the background. Thank you very much. While I've been in this country since 1962, in some ways I still feel like a Dane because I grew up in Denmark and I went to school in Denmark. Today, I'm going to share my personal experiences in a camp, in a concentration camp with you. I want to start off by saying I'm very, very lucky and thankful for being here today. The camp I was in had about 15,000 children. Less than 10%, about 1,200 survived. So how lucky can you be? I was both lucky, but I was also unlucky being sent to camp. I want to point out that you're going to be the last generation that will have an opportunity to listen directly to a survivor. As you heard earlier, I'm from 1935. In a couple of months, I'll be 86 years young, I like to think. And some years from now, say maybe 10 years or whatever, none of us will be able to relate to you or experiences as a Holocaust survivor. So whenever I talk to school, I ask everybody, teachers and students, faculty members, to be my ambassador. I ask each one to talk to at least 4 people, family and friends, tell them you know the Holocaust took place because you heard directly from an eyewitness. There are a number of reasons why this is important. First of all, research shows that younger people, and I'm not talking about students here, older than students, tend to forget what happened about 80 years ago, even though the Holocaust was documented more, better, more details than probably any other historical event. On top of that, and to me, that's a very sad situation, we have more and more deniers. People are denying that the Holocaust took place. I can never understand how they can deny it. Unfortunately, I never had a chance to convince a denier and the Holocaust did take place. But there are more and more of them. And I think the only way we can change that is by education, 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 and you talking to as many people as possible about the Holocaust. If I may have the first slide. On that slide, you see a book, the cover of the book that I wrote. It was updated about 2 years ago. The title is A Danish Boy in Theresienstadt. That's the camp I was in. Theresienstadt is the German version. Terezin would be the Czech version. It was located. It was then the Czechoslovakia. Today it is the Czech Republic. Reflections of a Holocaust survivor. There's only one reason why I wrote the book. I wanted to make sure that future generations would never forget that the Holocaust took place. If I may have the next slide. I'm showing a map of Denmark, and your teacher's family is from a place called Samsø, and maybe you can see it. It's just in the middle. It's an island in the middle of the country. I want to go back a long time. April the 9th, 1940, excuse me. I was 5 years old, but I still remember what happened. That evil man, Hitler, you couldn't trust him. He invaded Denmark and 20 other countries in Europe at different times. Denmark he invaded by land. You can see how we border to Germany on the south. By sea, and we're surrounded by sea and air. It was totally unexpected as far as the Danish were concerned. Denmark had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, like many other countries, so they figured they were going to continue to be neutral during the Holocaust. Little did they know how evil Hitler really was. It was a short battle, a few hours. No way could the Danish armed forces compete with the big war machine from Germany. And as a result, Denmark surrendered after a few hours. I'm not going to take sides or position on whether that was a good or a bad idea. I'll let history judge that, but I will say that it probably saved thousands of lives. I was born and raised in a town called Odense, or Odense, you may say, with a red frame, just about in the middle of the country. When I look back, I'm amazed. And I didn't realize it at the time because I was so young and didn't really understand what was going on, except I saw those soldiers in what I call ugly green uniforms walking up and down the streets. As a young boy, I tried to avoid them whenever I could. But why were things different in Denmark the first 3 years? A couple of reasons. And what I mean was different, was almost, and I want to emphasize the word almost, normal, but it was certainly normal compared to many other occupied countries. As an example, I was able to continue to go to public school. This would not have been possible if I lived in the Netherlands or Poland. My father, an attorney, was able to continue to practice law. At that time, we had about 8,000 Jewish people, most of them living in the northeast, around the capital of Copenhagen, out of a total population of 4.5 million, a very small ratio compared to many other countries. Consequently, Hitler didn't want to employ any more resources to Denmark than he had to. He was busy on so many different fronts, especially the Soviet. That was one of the reasons why conditions were relatively normal, with emphasis on relative. Another, and that might be the primary reason, we used to export a number of food products to Great Britain. Now they were directed to be shipped down to Germany to feed the people in Germany. And we also fed the troops in Denmark. As a matter of fact, I read a book recently, and some of the Nazi soldiers loved being in Denmark because they got better food, better meals than in other places in Europe. So those were the two primary reasons for conditions being relatively normal. The King of Denmark, on the next slide, please, King Christian X, he was in his early 70s, and he would be riding his horse every morning. You can see this picture was taken in 1940. He was a big, big supporter of the Danish Jews. He hated the Nazis. If you look at the picture, two Nazi soldiers saluting the king. The king is looking straight forward. He doesn't want to have anything to do with the soldiers. Not only was the king able to continue to rule, and it was amazing that he and the queen stayed behind. In most other countries, royalty would escape to either Great Britain and Canada. The government was also able to continue to govern with some restrictions. As an example, they couldn't employ any Jewish people. But again, I want to emphasize both situations, the king continuing to rule, the government continuing to govern, did not happen in any other country in Europe. On the next slide. Thank you. I don't know if you recognize that young fellow. The picture was taken in 1943, the summer of 43. If you recognize me, I guess I haven't changed very much, but there's a much more important reason why I want to share the picture with you. And I certainly didn't realize it at the time, being 8 years old. My mother, my father, and I were able to go on vacation. When I think back, how were we able to go on vacation, enjoying ourselves while the German troops was standing at just about every street corner? It's still hard for me to understand. Unfortunately, things changed dramatically in the fall of 1943. Is it possible to go back to the map, a few slides back? Thank you, that's terrific. What happened? Young people, upperclassmen in high school, students from colleges and universities, they were not happy that Denmark had surrendered so easily as far as they were concerned. So they formed resistance groups in just about every town you see on the map. One of the most famous one was the Churchill group, which started in my hometown in Odense. They were able to get weapons from our neighbors to the east, Sweden. You can see Sweden with a creamy color. Somehow Sweden managed to remain neutral. We also got weapons from our great allies from Great Britain. They would parachute them down at night, and the young people would go out and pick them up. Their main purpose was to prevent food products and other products manufactured in Denmark to reach Germany. They bombed factories, they bombed rails. In summary, they made life difficult for the commandant in Denmark. It's amazing they were so successful. It's a very risky operation. Many of them lost their lives. Some of them were shot, but they were truly what I refer to as upstanders. They were courageous. They stood up for what they thought were right. I lost my thought, but just give me a second. The commandant ended up going to the Danish prime minister, giving him an ultimatum, had to arrest the saboteurs, the young people, jail them, sentence them to death. There was, excuse me, somebody else will pick it up. There was no way, I'm sorry. There was no way the Danish government would agree to that. And as a result, they resigned. And that became the beginning of the arrest of the Jewish people, or what's referred to as the final solution. Once again, it was different in Denmark. A leading Nazi officer got word about the arrest date of the Danish Jews. And we're now talking about late September, early October 1943. Consequently, many families became upstanders. They were hiding Danish Jews in their homes. They were hiding them in churches, hospitals. Eventually, they were hiding in fishing boats and going across to Sweden. I think there were a total of 600 transports. Everybody who helped, they were really very, very courageous. And many of them lost their lives as a result of it. But what happened was that 7,500 Jewish people, mostly from the surrounding area of Copenhagen, escaped to Sweden and spent the next 18 months in Sweden. They were very good in Sweden to open up their borders for the Danes, and there were also Norwegians that were hiding in Sweden. Unfortunately, to my knowledge, my family in Odense, in the middle of the country, had not been alerted. I want to emphasize, and you may not realize it, that communications were so different in those days. As an example, we didn't have television. We certainly didn't have smartphones. We had to rely on newspaper, radio, and phone, and the phone lines were cut off. One early morning, I was 8 years old. It was October 2nd, 1943. Two Nazi officers pounded on the door of our apartment on the third floor. My father answered the door. To say he was surprised is an understatement of the day. My parents had not expected to be arrested after relatively normal conditions for well over 18 months. We got about 45 minutes to get ready, pack our suitcases, and then we were transferred. If you could move forward with the slides, please. Next one, please. Thank you, perfect. You can see the truck in the left-hand corner of the slide. We were transported in that truck into the middle of town. We were standing there, you can see 60 people. You cannot see 60, but you can see a number of people standing there. And they counted us and they counted us. They were shouting, they were screaming. I can never understand how it can take such a long time to count to 60. Later on, it was back in the truck. It was very cramped. And then on the next slide, you'll see a cattle car. The cattle car we were transported in was very similar to the one in front of you. Can you imagine spending more than 3 days, 3 nights in complete uncertainty, not knowing what was going to happen, where were we going to end up? It It was completely dark in the cattle car. No windows, no doors except one door on the side. It was locked. It was impossible to escape. It was completely dark. There was no light inside, no chairs, no blankets, and I can go on and on. It was so cramped that the adults had to alternate between standing and sitting for well over 3 days and 3 nights, while there were 4 children about my age, and we were able to lie down. I couldn't understand what was going on. My parents tried to explain it to their 8-year-old boy. Why was I here? My cousin wasn't here. My neighbor wasn't here. I couldn't quite understand what was going on. I can still see the frightened faces in front of me, and you can imagine how I felt, especially not understanding what was going on. We had nothing to eat, no food, no water. We brought some snacks and sandwiches ourselves, and we tried to share that among the group in the cattle car. The smell was getting worse and worse. There were no bathroom facilities. We had to use buckets in the corner. We made one stop, got some fresh air, got back, and some water, got back in. And later on the next slide, you will see us arriving in Tersen, a distance of 550 miles from Denmark. Tersen, located at that time it was called Czechoslovakia. Today it is the Czech Republic. On the next slide, you'll see the train station on the left, and you'll see the Jewish people walking. We had to walk about 1.5 miles from the train station into camp. At that time, there was no train station in Tersen. As soon as we arrived, we were ordered to empty our pockets. They took our money, valuables, they checked our luggage, whatever they could find of value, they took. It's hard to imagine how cruel people can be, but the German officers who arrested us and everybody else encouraged everybody, make sure you bring money, you'll be able to spend it later on. We were then split, women, men, children, seniors, into 4 different groups. Most children were staying in dormitory. As far as the Germans were concerned, you were a child if you were 15 years or younger. I can never understand how my mother was able to persuade the authorities that I should stay with her. As I mentioned earlier, I was 8 years old. And on the next picture, you'll see the loft, very similar, an illustration, and very similar to where my mother and I spent 18 long, long months. My father would have been staying in a similar loft, whereas the children would be spending time in dormitories. We slept on bunk beds. It was very hot in the summer, cold in the winter. I would wake up during the night, especially in the summer, scratching myself. My mother tried to explain to me about bed bugs and fleas. I hadn't heard about those things before. I think there might have been about 80 to 90 people in the loft. Everybody considered an adult, 16 years or older, had to do slave labor. That included both of my parents. My father, I mentioned, was a lawyer. He was used to litigation in the courthouse, working in an office. Unfortunately, he was exposed to some very, very heavy road work. which he wasn't used to. It was early in the winter. It was very cold. My mother told me that he lost about 50% of his body weight. We got very little food, and I'll cover that in a little while. A younger man in the same group told us later on how my father was physically abused and kicked, whipped, when he didn't perform up to the German standards with the road work. He also wore an overcoat during the winter months to protect himself. An officer came over and literally tore the coat off his shoulder and said, "You don't work with an overcoat." Easy to say when you don't provide uniforms. He ended up in infirmary where he spent about 2 to 3 months. Doctors, nurses, other inmates from many different countries were very, very capable, but they just didn't have the instruments, the supplies to save my father. And he passed away at the young age of 40, having been married to my mother for less than 10 years. I think at that time when she became a single parent, my mother was 38 years young. I was shocked when I heard about my father's death. And I think in many ways, it was good that I was staying with my mother, certainly for my sake, but maybe it also helped my mother. I'm not sure I totally appreciated being 8 years old, how difficult it must have been for my mother to be on her own with me. As far as I know, my mother was never physically abused, but she was mentally abused on a number of occasions. Once, and she had many different jobs, 10, 12 hours a day. She was cleaning, washing a floor in a huge factory, and she had finished her day's work. An officer came in, looked around, suddenly saw a bucket with dirty water, literally kicked the bucket, and the water streamed on the floor. And my mother had to redo the floor again. When she got back to the barrack, obviously, she was very, very tired, but she was very, very upset. I can never imagine how one human being can treat another human being in such a manner. Being 8 years old, I didn't have to work. My mother thought it would be a good idea to do some voluntary work. Time would pass faster. Not much you can do at that age. I became a messenger. I took documents, I took messages from one German office to the other. And I still remember trying to get in and out as fast as I could. They never spoke to me. I never spoke to them because I couldn't understand German and they couldn't understand Danish. They never touched me. They never harmed me. But they looked very, very intimidating with their guns. I worked for a couple of hours in the morning and again in the afternoon. One afternoon, being on my way back to the barracks, I passed the kitchen. I saw a big sack of raw potatoes, helped myself, I guess technically stealing, put one raw potato in each pocket, brought it home to my mother. I still remember how I looked around when I took the potatoes to make sure nobody saw me. I cannot imagine what would have happened if they had caught me. My mother and I needed all the help we could get, including the raw potatoes, which I did from time to time, stealing them, I mean, because we got very, very meager portions to eat. At breakfast, we would get substitute coffee, more hot water, with substitute coffee, about half a loaf of bread with some margarine to a whole family, and we had to share it and had a whole week, was a whole week's a meal. On the next slide, please, you'll see us lining up. We were lining up for food at lunch. I refer to it as the soup kitchen. Seemed to me that we got potato soup just about every day. A very generous description because it consisted of boiled water with potato peel. And we tried to get to the bottom of the kettle so at least we could get some nourishment. At dinner, we would line up again, different kinds of soups. I remember barley soup, but it was not the same soup every day, like potato soup at lunch. And once a week, we would get a special pasta dish, dumpling, a typical German dish. How were we able to survive on those meager portions? 35,000 inmates passed away, like my father, most of them from starvation. I may add that on my father's death certificate, they listed the reason for his death, pneumonia. They didn't want to tell the world that he died of starvation. So I believe the only reason I'm here today is the fact that we started getting packages after 6 months. Unfortunately, a few weeks too late to save my father. The packages consisted of clothing, of vitamins, and food. All nations were entitled to packages. We probably got more than any other nation because of the tremendous support system we had in Denmark, Christian friends, and with the Jewish people that had escaped to Sweden. One day, my mother is opening a package and she doesn't understand why it's so heavy. She opens it up, no food, no clothing, no vitamins. Would you believe that the guards had replaced the good stuff and put stones in the package? That's why it was so heavy. How can anybody get satisfaction out of treating another person that way? I can never understand it. So, I want to give you another example of life in camp. I was a growing boy. I was 9 years old. And I wore my shoes. I couldn't wear them anymore. I had outgrown them. No department stores where my mother could get shoes. So what did she do? She bartered with a Czech lady. The Czech lady got some Danish food. My mother got a pair of used shoes. They fitted me, and I was able to use them the rest of the time in camp. Being 9 years old at the time, I didn't realize or understood how valuable food was. Later on, I was told if you had food, you could get just about anything you desired. I'm often asked, what did I do when I wasn't lining up for food, working as a messenger? I spent time with other children. We played. We were all in the same boat. The adults were trying to bond with other adults, and the children were playing with each other. I especially liked playing soccer with some Czech children. We didn't have a real soccer ball. The mothers had taken some old clothes, tied them together, and we would kick it around on a gravel field. That was probably the only time I almost felt like a free person, forgetting, like a 9-year-old boy should, forgetting that I was a prisoner, forgetting that there was brick walls around the camp. And I had a great time. Then one day, the Czech children didn't show up. I went back later on that afternoon or early evening, told my mother about it. She said, "Don't worry, I'm sure the children will be back. They didn't feel like playing today." She knew what had happened to those poor children, but didn't think it was necessary that I was aware of what happened. And on the next slide, you'll see some cattle cars. You'll see a German officer on the right supervising what happened. 85,000 inmates from Tersen over a period of 3.5 years were transported to Auschwitz, Birkenau, and other gas chamber towns. It's amazing that I didn't know about it until later on, but my mother told me then there were terrible scenes at the station. The husbands wanted to be with their wives and vice versa, and they wanted to leave the children behind in Tersen because they figured they had a better chance of survival. The worst part about being in camp was the uncertainty. We never knew whether we would get enough food, would we get ill, would we be transported to an extermination camp, and so on. Would we survive? That was the worst thing. I'm looking at my clock and I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to skip the next 2 slides. And if we can move forward. One more, please. I call this happier times. Excuse me. On April the 15th, 1945, 18 long months after we arrived in camp, we were liberated by the white buses. You can see the Swedish flags on the side, the Red Cross logo. Sweden, as I mentioned earlier, was a neutral country. The buses were manned by Danish and Swedish drivers. I think there were probably a convoy of about 20. We couldn't believe it when we saw the buses, couldn't get into them fast enough. It was a miracle that they were able to drive through Germany. The war was still going on, and we were able to drive back through Germany. There was heavy bombardment. I remember a number of times we had to stop, and then we continued. We all survived, and on the next picture, we are crossing into Denmark, just past the border. When you look at that slide, you wouldn't think Denmark was still occupied. Row upon row of people welcoming us back. They gave us flowers, they gave us food, candy, and so on. And they seemed very happy to see us. This was April the 17th or 18th, we were in Denmark, a few short weeks away from total liberation and surrender by the Germans. But we didn't know that at the time. We didn't know what's going on. We didn't know about the other camps. We didn't know about the Allies defeating the Germans. In short, we didn't know what was going on in the outside world. We were busy enough being self-centered, making sure that we would make it from one day to the other. We were not able to stay in Denmark. We went to Sweden. We were in quarantine in Sweden for about 8 days. They wanted to make sure that we didn't bring any illnesses into the country. Later on, we reconnected with my family. They were all living in Copenhagen and escaped to Sweden. It was wonderful to see them again. It had been a long time. I still remember my mother wanted to run over and embrace her mother, but she didn't have the strength. She didn't have the energy. It was a very sad sight. On the other hand, it was wonderful to see my grandmother again. A few weeks later, on May the 5th, 1945, if we may have the next slide, I wanted to make sure that I also shared with you a Danish flag today. And on May the 5th, 1945, the Germans surrendered after 5 long years, a difficult time for the Danes. They celebrated as never before, and they used the Danish flag a lot, and it was flying everywhere. And since then, it has been flying every year on May the 5th. Some weeks later, my mother and I returned to Denmark, forever grateful to General Eisenhower and the Allies for defeating the Germans. If they had not defeated the Germans, I cannot imagine what would have happened to the rest of the world. We returned to my hometown, Odense. Our apartment had been rented out. There was always shortages. We were able to stay with friends. They were very, very helpful. The Danes got a warm, warm welcome when we got back, as you saw earlier in the picture. There was very little anti-Semitism in Denmark. There was some, but certainly not as much as in most of the other countries. In Poland, as an example, the local police would help arrest the Jews and hand them over to the Germans. In Denmark, the Danish police would help the Jews escape to Sweden. Quite a contrast. I was able to get back to my old school. I skipped most of third and all of fourth grade. There was no schooling in camps, in any camps. There were some private lessons. I got a private lesson from a teacher when I got back, and I was able to join my old schoolmates in fifth grade. Some years later, I graduated from high school, then from commercial college. Then I wanted to see part of the world, and I joined a Danish food company, had special training in Denmark. Then I went to England, Canada, and eventually United States. I stayed with the company for a few more years. Then I joined some American companies, and I retired. And I spent the entire time until I retired in 99. Time flies when you're my age. I cannot imagine it's 22 years since I retired. And I started talking to students like yourselves, about 10 years ago. And since then, I've talked to over 85,000, mostly students. It's a passion of mine. It's so important that we spread the word to as many people as possible. And I know you will help spread the word. I just want to show you on the final slide, that's my website, if anybody is interested in more background information. And I think this is a good time to stop, and maybe we can start with questions and answers.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions that did come in. And I'm not sure if the Q&A function is working. So if anyone wants, if you want to use the chat function, if you're watching, you can definitely use it. And I can see it that way. But the first question I got was, were any of the guards or soldiers lenient towards the prisoners that you would have witnessed?
If they were kind towards the prisoners, I didn't meet any of them. I'm not saying they weren't. There might have been some of them. But if they had been kind to the prisoners, they could have risked their lives. They could have ended up in jail. They could have been shot or whatever. So from their perspective, it was very dangerous if they did that.
Another question I got was, what is the most important thing for the students to take away from this discussion today?
That's a great question, and I'm glad it came up. I think there are a number of things you can take away. One would be never give up hope. I remember my mother was asked by a lot of people, or quite a few, did she ever give up hope? And she said, no, couldn't afford to do that with a 9-year-old boy. There were people that gave up hope. They didn't make it. My mother was a very, very strong lady. A couple of other things we can take away. One being, and I think we can learn that from the way Hitler and his people treated the Jews and other minorities. Respect each other. Be kind to each other. There's too much hate going on in the world today. Doesn't mean we have to love each other, but certainly be kind and respect each other. And whenever, and this is one of my favorite phrases about upstanders, and I hope that one day the word upstanders will appear in Webster's dictionary. Stand up for what you feel is right, be courageous, and that's basically what I think you can take away. Thank you for the question.
Next one was, who or what helped you most in the concentration camps?
I think my mother. I think it helped me a great deal that I was able to stay with my mother. I think it would have been all right if I'd been in a dormitory with other children, but I would say my mother helped me more than anything.
Next question was, after
Sorry,
all,
more than anybody. Sorry.
After all the hardships until the end of the war, what motivated you to keep going?
That's a good question. I think, especially after my father passed away, that I really wanted to survive. I cannot imagine losing my mother either. I'm sure she couldn't imagine losing me. It was hard enough to lose my father. So just trying to make it from one day to the other. Don't look ahead too far, but just stay around. Don't lose hope. Be faithful. Thank you.
Thank you. What did you dream about at night during this time period, during the Holocaust?
I don't remember dreaming about anything at that time. I might have, but I don't really remember it. Afterwards, I was very lucky because I didn't have any bad dreams. I didn't have nightmares. I think I was lucky being so young. I think for older people, like my mother, she suffered from bad nerves, bad hearing. There was a heavy bombardment going on, and she couldn't hear for about a week. Fortunately, part of her hearing returned. So I didn't dream of anything during the Holocaust that I can remember.
The next question, have you been back to the camp since leaving?
I went back to the camp in 2009. I wanted to see it for myself as a free person. My wife joined me. She was very concerned that it would come back to me and I would suffer as a result. But I'm glad I went back. I was able to do some research. I was able to see where I played soccer. I was able to see where we lived. The camp looked much bigger than I remember it. And at the end of the tour, I was told that the barracks had been converted to apartments. About 2,000 people living in those apartments. That must be like living in a ghost town. I can never understand how anybody could live there. I remember my mother was asked many times, did she want to go back to the camp? And she said, once was more than enough. I felt differently about it. I'm not saying once it's right or wrong, one way or the other. But while I was in camp, I could often hear my mother's voice, Steen, why did you want to go back? but I'm glad I did.
Another question was, did you recognize anyone when you first got to the camp? Like, was it aside from any family?
No, I didn't recognize anybody except my aunt and uncle and their son. They were from Copenhagen, and they were on their way escaping to Sweden, and they were arrested. So obviously I recognized them, but I didn't recognize any families. We were the only family from my hometown, Jewish family from my hometown. There was just one other Jewish family from the town, and they managed to escape.
Next question was, do you remember what you took when they arrested you? When they allowed you to take possessions with you? Do you remember what you took with?
No, not exactly, because as I remembered, I think my mother packed most of it. I do know that I missed my teddy bear because the teddy bear stayed behind. But other than that, no, just the necessary thing, just the clothing. We wore our regular clothes in camp. We did not have, like they did in some camps, have the striped pajamas, as I refer to them.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if there was something that you remembered most that you didn't get to take with you, and I guess the teddy bear was
the teddy bear, yes.
Next question was, after seeing this dark side of human nature, has it changed how you perceive people and strangers?
It's another good question. I think it has. I like to think I'm more tolerant as a result of it. I like to think that I respect other people, because I think I have learned that. And those would be some of the things that would be different. I think, if I may add, I think many of us take life for granted, and I think after what I've gone through, I don't think I take my life for granted anymore.
Next question is, why do you think that people deny that the Holocaust ever happened?
Well, first of all, I think they're crazy. Number two, many cases it's a form of anti-Semitism, and there's unfortunately an increasing amount of anti-Semitism. It has resulted in vandalism of synagogues and other Jewish property, not only in the United States, but there was the unfortunate shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh a few years ago. It has happened in Europe. It has happened in Paris, as an example, on a number of times.
Was it hard to reunite the families together after everything ended?
You mean my family?
Yeah, I know it was difficult for most families in other camps, like in Poland and whatnot. Yeah. But in your experience,
I think what helped me a great deal was the fact that I was able to go back to my old school, and the same class that I would normally be in, so I had the same friends. I think that helped a great deal. The first few months was very hard because we used to be a nice little family of three. Now we were only two. But what helped a great deal, people were so helpful and understanding. And I remember when people would ask us what happened in camp, and obviously people wanted to know what went on. My mother would often say, please ask her. She didn't want me to be, she was shielding me. She didn't want me to be too involved in it.
We have a lot of questions, and I know you only have a certain amount of time, but there are two questions that I've come across that I think that are interesting. So one was, since you were part of this horrific event at such a young age, how do you think it affected you in your teenage years or adulthood?
I think I'm very lucky, because you would think that it would have impacted me a great deal more. I might have had nightmares. I might have gotten bad nerves. But again, as I mentioned earlier, being so young, I think that helped me. What's strange is for a long time, and it's typical for many survivors, we didn't talk about it. I didn't talk that much to my mother about it. I talked some to obviously my wife knew about it. I talked some to my children. But I changed a great deal after I wrote my book. I had not intended to talk to students, but I started talking to an 8th grade class, including my grandson. And I got such satisfaction out of the students. They all asked good questions, great questions like today. Answering questions is my favorite part of the presentation. So I cannot imagine not starting to talk to students and go to my grave without it. And I'm very grateful for that. So I think I have changed over the years.
Another question was, do you still experience instances of anti-Semitism today? I'm assuming this is not just witnessing, but like in your, like I guess personally.
I have not personally experienced anti-Semitism, which is kind of surprising. But I've seen it in some towns. I heard about a teacher having a son playing with a neighbor, and when the neighbor found out that he was Jewish, he wasn't allowed to play anymore with the boy. It's a country club in Deerfield Highland Park. That's for Jewish people only, or for Christian, and then there's another one for Jewish people. So I'm well aware of it, and whether it's anti-Semitism or racism, it just doesn't have any place on this earth.
Well, Steen, the class period is coming to an end, and so I don't know if you have time for one or two more questions, as some people are sticking around for the passing period. But if you need to get going, we understand. It is 11:45, 11:46 now.
I'll take a couple of more questions, and then if they have more questions afterwards, if you want to forward them in my email to me, I'll be happy to answer.
Fantastic. I can definitely do that and get those out to everybody. The next question was, do you ever experience survivor's guilt?
Oh, that's another good question. That reminds me of a very similar question an 8th grader asked me 2 or 3 years ago. Do you feel guilty or lucky being alive today? Maybe I should feel guilty, but I don't. But I'm certainly very appreciative, and I feel very lucky being alive. Thank you.
Another question was, how has technology helped you getting your story out there to others to hear?
It helped me when I wrote my book. I cannot imagine writing the book without the use of a computer. And I think we all take for granted that we have a computer forever. You all grew up with a computer. I did not grow up with a computer. As a matter of fact, I retired in 1999. At that time, I didn't use a computer at work. It has helped a great deal during COVID-19. I love the personal contact when I'm out of the schools, but we're not able to do that. And now using Zoom, I talk to a number of students. In the next couple of months, I have several scheduled. I'm going to speak to a library. I wouldn't have been able to do that without the Zoom or similar video call technology.
Well, yeah, well, we're certainly glad it's available to us today. Here's an interesting question. Did you happen to encounter or hear anyone planning to escape the camp while you were there?
Yeah, there were some young people that tried to escape. Most of them were not successful. They had a big brick wall around it, barbed wire on top, watchtowers, and dogs at the bottom. So there were more people that tried to escape and they were shot than actually were successful.
Another question we got was, have you ever talked with other Holocaust survivors? And if so, what were the parallels between those experiences? It's kind of a big question, but
we all had different experiences. If you listen to other survivors, it all depends on what camp you were in, what age you were, and your background. But I met 3 or 4 other survivors in the Chicago area from Theresienstadt, and we like to compare notes.
another one was
Maybe just one more, and then I have to go.
sure, absolutely. I'll go one more. Do you think the movies and books depict the concentration camps as they really were?
Most of them do, not all the descriptions. I think Schindler's List was accurate. I think Night, many students read the book Night by Elie Wiesel.
Many of us will, yes.
I think that's accurate. I think Anne Frank's diary, as an example, is accurate. So in total, I think they're quite accurate.
Well, there were a couple questions we didn't get to. I'll be happy to email them to you, and then I can respond to the students with what your answers were.
I'm sorry I have to leave, but I thought they were excellent questions, and I appreciate everybody being there today. And please don't forget your homework.
You're getting a lot of thank yous coming through from all the participants, and so we appreciate this opportunity to talk with you, and hopefully we can talk to you again, hopefully next year as well.
Hopefully live next person. In
yes.
person.
Yes, thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you for coordinating it all.